Mhm.
And we're live.
We're good to go.
I believe so. Should be.
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that we're in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwa, Innu, Cree, and Dakotas people, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3 territory. I'd like to introduce members of the panel. Via Zoom is Mr. Bill Moretsky and Ms. Lynn Nesbitt. My name is Stu McPherson. I'll be chairing the hearing today. And in the hearing room is Mr. Jason Robinson, who's going to be the secretary. And also via Zoom is the assessor, Mr. Merrick Froelich. We'll be hearing applications for revision of the assessment roll in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested has been described in each application and will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that are made at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Please be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the Board of Revision. The Board of Revision is appointed annually by Council. It's independent of it and the City Administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of King's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included in the board's orders. With respect to the hearing process, I'll confirm the points of appeal with the property to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We'll then have the assessor's testimony followed by questions the applicant may have, and then the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they so wish. Once all the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave and the process will repeat for each item on the docket. The session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You'll receive the board's decision by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. We'll be hearing items number 1, 6, and 7 on our docket today. Mr. Robertson, if you would please affirm the assessor and the applicant's testimony.
Mr. Assessor,
Yes,
please state your full name.
Merrick Froelich.
Do you affirm that the evidence you are about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Mr. Applicant,
Rod Slaughter?
do you affirm that the evidence you are about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Slaughter, you're here representing the owners of 3 properties, all of which we're dealing with the matter of the assessed value. Is that correct?
That's correct. One of the properties, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to simply ask for a confirmation via section 54(1).
Okay, we will deal with that when we get to it. We'll deal with them in order, 1, 6, and 7. So there are no other preliminary issues to deal with at this time from either the applicant or the assessor. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. So we'll just deal with the first one, item number 1, 375 Dawson Road. And Mr. Assessor, when you're ready, we'll hear your evidence, please.
And as I go through my presentations, in a perfect world, I would have loved to have the opportunity to inspect the three properties that are on the docket today. Unfortunately, just because of time constraints and workload, it's not possible. On some of the other properties that we were able to do the 15-1s on, I was able to inspect them, which is why we were able to come to agreement on them. So from my perspective, in a perfect world, a 54-1 for all these properties would be perfect, but I will continue forward. Roll number is 06-031-94-0500. The 23 assessed value is $2,538,000. There are 6 buildings on this. There's 6 buildings on this property with 4 different premises. The years built are ranged from 1925 to 2020, and effective year built is from 1947 to 2020. The wall heights vary between 60 to 20 feet. The land area is 276,148, and the total leasable area is 41,105. This property is a hydro substation. I'm asking for the value to be confirmed, and like I had stated before, the 2020 value was $2,606,000, but there was not enough time for an inspection. This property is valuated on the cost approach, because substations don't go onto the marketplace at all. So we have different substations available. The first substation on page 3 was built in 1947. It has an effective year of 1947, and the area for this one's 3,678. Next one was built in this, has the same effective year of 2,220. And what you'll end up seeing as you're going through this process here on the side, I'm not going through all the different particulars, but the reconstruction, new, less depreciation is the value of how we total all the values for the properties here. So the first one was 79,870. The second one is 111,599. On page 4, the next building has an effective year built of 1956. An area of 4,880 square feet, and the total cost for this one, less depreciation, is 56,176. On top of page 5, 4,080 square feet. Effective year built is 1963. The total is 138,553. On the bottom part of page 5, we have another area of 2,440 square feet. With a building cost of 205,028. On the top of page 6, we have a building addition that happened in 1968 of 800 square feet. On top of page 7, we have additional a new area that it was built up. This was 7,560 square feet, effective year built 1981. With the cost there of 79,430. There's another building addition that took place in 2014 of 2,080, and the total cost there is 132,880. Finally, there was the last building addition that took place in 2020, and this building addition is very similar to the one on 95 Pegwest, where we were able to come to an agreement on. I have pictures of 95 Pegwest on our file. The area here is 6,200, both for the main floor and for the basement area. We have effective year built of 2020, and the total is 501,021 for the main floor, and 287,813 for the basement, which is roughly half the building cost of the total. So the pictures that we do have of the basement space is a bit different than what the applicant has provided on 95 Pegwest, and the applicant and I had discussed that prior to this. There's also detached structures of $10,000, and we're looking at the land rate. So we have the land area is 276,148. And we're using a rental rate of square foot of $4.42 to come with $1,220,000. Once we accumulated all the building cost of $1,318,000 with the land value of $1,220,000, we came up with $2,538,000. Bottom of page 9 shows the class and liability status of this. And with the $4.42 dollars a square foot rent that we've used, I have two comparables that are very nearby on 663 Marion and 314 Dawson. Those rental rates were on $5.14 a square foot and $4.08 a square foot. But both of these sales are significantly far away from the reference date of April 1st, 2021. We all know that land rates have gone up. And so I'm very comfortable with the land rate that we've used of the $4.42. And I got two additional land sales that have taken place in the New St. Boniface Industrial Park of 337 and 536. We don't have to use capitalization rates here because of the nature of the property. And what we have here on page 13 is an overall big picture view of where it's located at in the old part of the St. Boniface Industrial Park. It is west of La Jamodier. And if we're looking at the bottom of page 13, you can see the different buildings that are located on the left-hand side. And with Turnette being the border, the new building that was constructed in 2020 is the one on the east side of Turnette. On page 14 are some additional pictures that we have here showing an overview of the subject property. I did not have the property to inspect this property, but if the property does go to the municipal board, I will look forward to an inspection of this property. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Slock, questions for the assessor?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a bit of rebuttal evidence as well, but I'll ask to have that submitted after all questions.
Yes, we'll deal with that. Thank you.
Mr. Froelich, hope you're doing well.
I am. Thank you, Rod.
Good.
Just trying to keep my head above water.
I know the feeling. So you mentioned that you didn't have a chance to inspect this particular property.
That's correct.
Okay. Essentially, though, the property is the external substation with other buildings on site, including an office and some industrial buildings. Is that correct?
I've never inspected it, but based on what we have in the cost report, that is correct.
Okay. And you agree that the legislation states that the assessment is to be based on market value, correct?
Market value consisting of, but in this situation, this property doesn't go to market, so you got to evaluate it on cost.
And would you agree, though, that typically industrial and office buildings are valued via the income approach as the best indicator of market value? Do you agree?
But this property that we're dealing here with right now is a hydro substation. It would never go onto the marketplace.
So the cost for these ancillary buildings, the value for these ancillary buildings has been done via a cost approach using Marshall and Swift. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's CoreLogic now, but
okay, yeah, the same idea, right? And what you do in these cases is you try and determine for each structure what Marshall and Swift or CoreLogic code would best apply, and that becomes the basis of the replacement cost new. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct.
Okay. And when you do that, anything that's not included in the base cost, you would then add via Marshall and Swift via other codes.
Be more specific, please.
So if you, for example, costed the structure, if it's a storage warehouse and you've costed it as storage warehouse 406, you may find that it includes or does not include certain items that you would have to add for then in the costing.
After an inspection, that would be done, correct.
Okay. So if I can ask you to turn to page, oh, sorry, one more question on that. And when you add areas, for example, a basement, one would think that the code remains as a storage warehouse, and then you would add a basement in Marshall and Swift to that structure.
Well, because it would be a separate area, so there would be another subsection off of that. So
subsection, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. So if I could ask you to turn to page 3, I just want to make sure I understand how the costing is done here. If I could ask the board to turn to page 3, this is the costing summary for the first of the buildings, built in 1925, effective year 1947. So Mr. Froelich, I guess the question is, it's coded as the storage warehouse 406. You've then added, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down. It says element and description, exterior walls. And there's exterior walls added to this replacement cost new. Would walls not be part of the base cost already? Do you know why
On the top part or
walls
the
were
bottom
added
part?
separately?
On the top of page 3, I see masonry walls, brick backup, and electric.
Yeah, so it's the second one down of those 3 items. It has base cost, masonry bearing walls is the description of the
Yeah,
structure.
the first
And then
one.
below that is exterior wall 1, cavity brick. So I'm wondering why, if it, the base cost obviously includes walls, why walls would be then added separately as well.
No, well, it's only added once, Rob, because you just add the walls one period of time. So there's no value associated for the walls. So if we didn't capture the walls here, the walls would not be captured at all.
So the walls are not part of the base cost, you mean?
No,
Or
well,
the,
there's 2 aspects of the base cost. There's the masonry bearing walls and there's the cavity brick block up, backup.
Okay.
Different rates.
yeah, I'm not sure I understand. Okay, thank you, Mr. Froelich. And then below that is where you add for the basement. Is that correct?
That is, just give me 1 sec here. That is the basement, yes.
Yeah, but that is coded as an industrial engineering building, not as the storage warehouse.
Which
You
is
know
why I
that-
cannot reiterate more so enough that an inspection is required for this property.
Okay. Would it not be typical, though, that the basement should be of the same code?
Which is why an inspection is required for this property.
No problem.
You know,
Thank you, Mr.
You know, if I change things without doing a visual of this property or seeing it, I'm doing a disservice to the taxpayer of the city of Winnipeg. If I change things without doing my due diligence.
Okay, and to none of the buildings, we could go through each of the pages, but I'll just summarize this. To none of the buildings has any obsolescence been added. The only depreciation is because of the age life. Is that correct?
That's what we have on our forms here today, correct?
Okay. I think that is all the questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I thank you. Mr. Moreski, questions for the assessor?
Yes, on the land aspect of it. If I can just find the page here, if you can give me a moment. Page 9, reference page 9. Below land, you have land notes, class liability, and it has adjustment, 25% adjustment applied, 406,811. What can you elaborate on that? How was that applied?
Well, my guess is because of the substation that's built underneath it. So any potential remediation costs that would be required.
Mm-hmm. So is it within that rate you have there of 442 then? That adjustment?
You know what? I would have to double check. Because if I do the math here. Yeah, so what happens is the price, the actual model rent would be higher. That includes so it would be up by 25%. So roughly speaking, it would be around the $5, the mid $5 range.
All right. Okay, and just getting back to your methodology to begin with, you said this is a substation. That's why you use the cost approach. So you used kind of the term substation and applied it to the entire property. However, I see only 2 of the buildings are actually a substation, and the other 2 are just normal warehouses and offices. Is that a correct observation?
Well, no, because when you end up looking at it, Because if you look at the new buildings that are taking place here with regards to the storage warehouse components of it, you know, that even though it's listed as storage warehouse, that has electrical equipment to facilitate the power for this part of the neighborhood. So these buildings here per se, where these for the 2020 section, and I'm guessing for the 2014 section, they're all a part of producing electricity for Manitoba Hydro. So even though they're not listed as a substation per se on the commercial report, it feeds into the substation territory. So what we end up doing is like, we'll look at guidelines from CoreLogic and then sort of try to put them into applicable area.
Right. Okay, so the 80% normal depreciation, how did you come up with that?
On which part?
Well, there's I think the majority of the buildings have an 80% normal depreciation applied.
Let me just look. Yeah.
Less normal depreciation.
Yeah, I think what ends up happening here, that's the bottom line baseline of all properties. So at a certain stage, like if you look at the effective year of a building per se, at some point it doesn't go any lower than the base. So the 80%, it's just telling us that it still has some value to it, but it's from a depreciation perspective, it's not going to depreciate any more than 80%.
So would that criteria have come from CoreLogic, or is that a model driven criteria?
We would get that information from CoreLogic.
Okay.
And other similar properties across North America.
Okay. Okay, good. Thank you very much. No further questions.
Thank you. Ms. Nesbitt, questions?
Yeah, I have just a quick question. You indicated that the warehouse component is done on the cost approach. Has it always been done on a cost approach, or is this a changed methodology?
No, this property has, well, during my time in industrial since 2019, but and prior to that, I think the first year hydro properties, when the hydro properties were a part of Winnipeg Hydro, they were never appealed. And they did start getting it appealed until 2016, 2018. But it's my understanding that these properties have always been done on the cost approach.
Okay, and would you say that the warehouse component is integral to the remainder of the?
And in Rod's pictures here in his document, because it's very similar to the inspection that I had done on 95 Peguis. There's a substation here, and so when you see the pictures on page 13 of the applicant's brief, it's very similar to 95 Peguis, and I would say yes, it's integral to the.
So, in your view, could there ever be a scenario where the storage warehouse could be split off and sold as a storage warehouse on the market?
Very unlikely.
Okay.
But anything can happen in our world, you know that. Because there's always going to be need for electricity. And if anything, there'll be more substations available because, you know, it is this original area served Winnipeg in the start of the 20th century.
Okay. Okay, that's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Froelich, did you prepare the cost reports on this property?
Not on this one, but I have on other ones. I know I've done it on 95 Peguis.
Okay, so this one was done
by one of my peers.
By one of your peers. And just following up on the applicant's question, on the exterior wall, is that a cost that's over and above the base cost? Because
I don't believe so.
it's,
Because if you look at all the walls here, you know, they're all listed twice. You know, there's base cost of there's exterior wall, and then there's nothing for the basement space where these have taken place. So I don't believe so.
I understand that, but is there a description of what's included in the base cost anywhere in the costing manual? Does it tell you it's got walls and floor and ceiling and?
Yeah, I don't have access to that information right now.
Okay. So you're not aware whether it is or not?
I am not aware. No.
Okay, I thank you. And as far as the land goes, that was also a question I had. So you're saying that 25% reduction was already incorporated in the 442?
That's correct.
And the original cost was in the $5 range?
Yeah, so if you go. So the original land rate would be around $5.52.
And if I look at
the range of the sales that I've looked on page 10, right? So
well,
if you're
I'm looking at those, and does the economy of scale come into effect with land as well or not?
Economies of scale do factor in, you know, but you know, it's within the range, you know, so our subject property is a bit smaller, a bit bigger than my comparables, but it you know, I'm comfortable with the land values that I presented here today.
Okay, I thank you. Mr. Slaughter, we'll hear from you, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would you prefer my rebuttal first and then the direct evidence?
No, I would like your direct evidence first, please.
Certainly. Okay. Thank you very much. So if you could please refer to the document that does not say rebuttal evidence.
Before we start, Rod, can I actually get my rebuttal evidence sent to me? Because I don't think anything's been sent yet.
That's,
Okay.
I sent it via email to you, Merrick.
Okay, was it this morning?
No, it was at the start of the hearing.
Okay, yeah.
Do you need a moment?
Well, you know
need a
what?
moment to-
Let's go through the brief. Let's go through the brief. I'll ask my questions, you ask your questions, and then I wouldn't mind a 5-minute recess so I could actually take a look at the rebuttal evidence if possible.
Okay, let's go ahead with your presentation then, please, Mr. Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'll ask the board, please, to turn to page 6. The first number of pages are just preamble about the approach and the scope of the work. I will mention that I did not have a chance to inspect the property before composing the report, but I was in direct conversations with the representative from Manitoba Hydro, had photographs provided, had a good understanding of all areas of site. Once the evidence was submitted, Mr. Chairman, I did have the chance to inspect the property. So I have fully inspected the property now. And there were no surprises from my original description provided by Manitoba Hydro. So on page 6, I'd like to start with kind of an overview of assessment for Manitoba Hydro assets. You may be aware that the property is currently classified as a grant in lieu property. So what that means is by the Municipal Assessment Act, according to sections 22(1), the property should be exempt. But then there's an agreement where they will pay a grant in lieu to equate to what it would be had it been taxed in the first place. But the grants in lieu have a few caveats as described in the Manitoba Hydro Act. So at the bottom of page 6, you will see language about the grants that are to be applied. And the last paragraph, exemption from municipal taxation, states 43(2.2), for greater certainty and without limiting any exemption from municipal taxation under the Municipal Assessment Act, the corporation and its subsidiaries are exempt from all taxes levied by a municipality on the following property. So they're complete, they don't pay grants on. A, conduits, poles, pipes, wires, transmission lines, plant, equipment, and any similar property owned by the corporation or any of its subsidiaries or occupied or used by any of them in the generation, transformation, transmission, or distribution of power. The intent of this, Mr. Chairman, is that these assets are to provide power to all Manitobans. And while Manitoba Hydro shall pay grants in lieu on structures that are not part of the transmission of electricity, they should not be paying on, for example, the actual substation. Part B is any land on or under which such property is situated. So, of course, if the substation occupies approximately a quarter of the land, theoretically, it should not be paying tax on that 25% of the land because it is land situated under the equipment which is necessary for the generation, transformation, transmission, or distribution of power. Now, if we follow that through, any of the improvements which are completely tied to the transmission of electricity or necessary for the substation, they would be under Part A as plant, and they should not be taxed. But for the purposes of this report, we are considering those assets as taxable under the grant in lieu for the reason that we do believe there is market value to these assets. You can have, it's not common, but you can have legacy substations decommissioned and assets sold. This happened at 340 Rutland actually about a year or two ago. So we have two ways of looking at this. Either the assets are necessary and part of the substation, in which case I would submit that they should not be paying a grant in lieu, or we determine what the market value of those assets is, not the value in use. And I would like the board to refer to the top of page 7 just to reiterate the assessment legislation. The definition of value, as it appears in the Municipal Assessment Act, is as follows. In respect of a property being assessed under this act, the amount which the property might reasonably be expected to realize if sold in the open market, in the applicable reference year, by a willing seller and a willing buyer. So I hope that gives some context or some information about how we are valuing these today. We are applying a value to these ancillary buildings, which in my mind should be valued on market approach as per the legislation, because they're basically an office and storage buildings. Page 8, I'll go through some photographs of the property for the board's reference. The property is kind of an irregular shaped property in what is described as the old St. Boniface Industrial Park. This is differentiated from the new St. Boniface Industrial Park, which is further east, which is a far superior area. The property is bounded by Dawson Road along the southwest side, and Dugald Road to the north. The buildings at the bottom of page 8, I'll go through each one. The first is the office building with the addition, and it does have a lower level as well. So you can see that at the bottom of page 8. At the top of page 9 is the 1980s vintage storage warehouse. This is basically an equipment storage warehouse, vehicle storage. They have many vehicles on the site, and this is where they'll do repairs, for example. And then at the bottom of page 9 is the latest storage warehouse. And what this structure was designed for, Mr. Chairman, is basically some of the equipment that had been external for the substation, they've brought internal. And this houses the backup generators and the batteries for the substation. It's a basic rigid steel structure warehouse, storage warehouse with no office. It has a basement, but the basement is only to fulfill the requirement that the wiring and conduits need to be separated in case of a power outage. Rather than stepping through, they have these below so they can be easily serviced. It's not accessible by elevator. The only purpose is for the wiring and the conduits. I'll just pause for a moment because you'll see pictures of that basement in a moment, but I'll go through each building for the internal photographs now. So on page 10, I'll just back up to the office building. We have the, it's a very basic office. And really, the function of this building is becoming less and less as they move staff away from this site to other locations. And that's one of the things that you'll find with these older legacy substations is that some of these ancillary buildings become relatively obsolete as time goes on. On page 11 is a building that is obsolete now. This is the original substation building, the 1925 vintage with the 1947 effective age. This has been replaced by the new building. So they will actually decommission this building fairly soon. Very basic structure. Again, there's no office. It's just very basic area for the storage of the backup generators, and then the wiring in the basement that you can see, again, accessed only by a staircase. Page 12 is the vehicle service garage, basic rigid steel storage warehouse without any office. And finally, the recent building, you can see the backup equipment, and then the basement, you can see the wiring and the conduits through the basement. So this is one of the concerns that we have, Mr. Chairman. Number one is if we're valuing these buildings, if we are valuing these buildings, and we value them on based on their market value, I don't know if the cost approach is the most applicable. The boards have continuously said, and I'll quote municipal board order pertaining to the Canadian Newspapers Company versus the City of Winnipeg, A02-014. And the quote is, the board has consistently applied the income approach in valuing office, industrial, and warehouse space. And the reason is the cost is fine, but we have to be careful that we recognize all obsolescences, locational, functional, market, rather than just the age life of the building. And the best way to determine that, in our opinion, is by looking to a more market-facing approach. Mr. Froelich had gone through all of the building description, so I don't need to reiterate that in the property and land description. So I will move first to page 16, Mr. Chairman. And that's where we talk about the cost approach and the cautions that should be applied when relying on that approach for these type of properties. But what we have done is taken a look at what the city has used for their costing. And I have many concerns about how they're costed, which I'll describe in my rebuttal. But for the moment, I'd just like to say one thing. Even if we accepted the city's replacement cost new on these structures and did not apply any additional obsolescence, one of the first concerns I have is that the market value of that basement space is, in my mind, extremely limited, if nil. I cannot think of any reason why the market would value industrial basement space, and that's assuming that the equipment is not taking up the space, but industrial basement space without any proper access of elevators. Any purpose of this would be for storage, and you can't really use an industrial basement without proper access from an elevator. It was designed for one purpose, and the market would not value it as such. So what we have done is we have applied a 50% obsolescence factor to all basement or lower level space. And that's assuming, again, that we accept everything else about the city's cost, which as I go through my rebuttal, you will see that I do not. So right off the top, if we applied that to the basement alone, and then we added the fencing cost, we would have a replacement cost new, less depreciation and obsolescence of $1,124,000. On page 18 is the land component of the cost approach. I'd like to commend the board. Your questions were excellent regarding the land. I didn't know what to make of the adjustment. That got right to the point. And the economies of scale is also something, Mr. Chairman, that I was concerned about. 3 of the 4 comparisons of the city are considerably smaller. 2 of the 4 are located in the aforementioned new St. Boniface Industrial Park, which in my mind is far superior. I'm going to talk about the other 2 comparisons in rebuttal. We'll put that aside for a moment. We have looked at our own comparisons for land, and they're on page 18. There are 9 comparisons that we've looked at, ranging in size. The best comparisons are numbers 4 through 8 due to the size, not number 9. And they range in sale price from $402 a square foot to $547. However, the ones at the higher end of the range are in the newer St. Boniface Industrial Park. So we feel that the subject would be at the lower end of that scale, and that's at $425 a square foot in our opinion. Now, even that though, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to use caution with. Number 1, we haven't accounted for the land under the substation, which by the Hydro Act should not even be applied a grant in lieu. And secondly, there is a concern, as the city seems to be trying to approach with their adjustment, of the remediation costs. And we know this now because we've analyzed what happened at that property, 340 Rutland. There will be costs to remediate a site should this equipment be removed. Notwithstanding those points, we feel that a value of no higher than $425 a square foot would be appropriate to the entire land area. So I complete my my cost approach, Mr. Chairman, by taking the RCNLD of 1,124,000 and then adding the land value at $425 a square foot, which is 1,116,000. It brings us to a cost approach value of $2,240,000. But again, there's a lot of questions in my mind about the applicability of that approach, which is why we then move to page 19, where we try and do a market approach. So step one in our income approach to value is we try and determine an appropriate market rent for these different structures, which is difficult, but not impossible, because there are structures very similar to this throughout the market that do rent. And we have a list of 16 comparisons at the bottom of page 19. We feel that not all are the best comparisons, but we do put a lot of weight on number one, which is at $6.80 a square foot. Number two, also a single tenant building built in 1979 at $538 a square foot. Number five, part of a multi-tenant property at $695 a square foot, 5,328 square feet. Number six is 8,176 square feet at $6.50. And number seven, a single tenant 1989 vintage building, 10,288 square feet, $6.80 a square foot. And then we have some others of varying sizes through. But the point is, Mr. Chairman, that when we look at these rents, we're typically ranging from about $6 to $7 a square foot. That's typically what the market would apply to these. All of these comparisons will have some degree of office as well, which the subject, except for the office building itself, does not have. So on page 20, we've gone through each of the buildings and applied what we feel is an appropriate market rent. At the lowest end, based on the very last comparison on page 19, would be the 1925 building that is now obsolete and going to be decommissioned. We apply $4 a square foot to the main floor. And again, I don't think any value should be applied to the basement, but we're putting a nominal value of $1 a square foot on that basement space. The 1950s vintage steel frame warehouse would also be at the lower end, but slightly higher. We're at $5 a square foot for that structure. For the office building, again, very dated, very basic. We're at $7 a square foot and a nominal rate of $1 on the basement. That's 1963 vintage. Storage building at $5 a square foot. The 1981 storage building at $5 a square foot. The 2014 edition at $6 a square foot. And finally, the latest storage warehouse at $7.50 a square foot at the higher end of the range, with a nominal $2 a square foot on the basement. And if we summarize all those, Mr. Chairman, we would come to a blended market rent of $4.62 a square foot, including the basement, for a total market rent of $185,512. We look to the City of Winnipeg's market parameters for industrial locations in Old St. Boniface, and we accept the market vacancy allowance of 4%, standard adjustment that's applied to all income approach valuations, and $3.85 a square foot for the shortfall on that vacant space. Now, Mr. Chairman, we typically have a very lengthy section of our presentation at this point around non-recovered expenses. I'm going to simplify this today by saying if the proper capitalization rate and market parameters are applied, based on our opinion, we would accept the 3% non-recovered allowance. We'll move past that. And lastly, the appropriate capitalization rate to apply. So Altus had undertaken a complete industrial property cap rate study, but I'm only going to summarize that today. We had looked at 5 comparisons in the market that sold between 2018 and 2020. You can see those at the top of page 22. And in my opinion, numbers 1, 2, and 4 would be the most appropriate. Number 1 is at 100 McPhillips. It's an inferior property, older as well. Number 2 is 110 Sutherland. It's kind of a similar industrial sort of location. And number 4 is in the St. James industrial location. It's 1221 Sherwin. These capitalization rates range from 7.42% for the last one mentioned, up to a high of 9.16% for the McPhillips property. This would definitely be considered either the low end of Class B or perhaps even non-investment grade industrial. And based on our findings, that would result in a capitalization rate of approximately 7.5%. Now, I should note, and I know we're not supposed to look at other assessments, but the subject assessment had been done for the last cycle, both by the cost and the income approach by the city. And if you turn to the very last page of my brief, Mr. Chairman, you should find the income approach valuation from last cycle. From 2020 to 22, it should look like this. So they had done an income approach. We don't necessarily agree with the market rents in this case. This property was not appealed last cycle. The capitalization rate last cycle, Mr. Chairman, was 7.75%. So I think we're being consistent in our methodology from what the city had done, at least from a capitalization rate point perspective. So on page 23, we summarize our market income approach to value. I mentioned our rationale for the market rent, vacancy allowance, non-recovered expenses, and a capitalization rate of 7.5%. And that results in a value of $2,221,000 rounded. On page 24, then we have a reconciliation of the two values. Very close in value between the two approaches. Cost approach is very, very slightly higher at $2,240,000. But for all the reasons mentioned earlier, we feel there are a lot of questions about the applicability of the cost approach. We prefer the market-based approach. So we ask the board to consider our income approach value of $2,221,000. In appendix, Mr. Chairman, are simply some of the assessment background and the valuation from the city for the 2020 cycle. And that completes our presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Furlock, do you have questions for the applicant?
Yes, I do. What was the assessed value of this property in 2020, Rod?
1 moment, please. Should be a summary here, $2,538,000.
So are you implying that we used the income approach to value in 2020? Because that's what you stated in your brief.
Am I implying that you use the cost?
Well,
approach?
you're showing the 2020 value of the income approach to value, but did we use $3,193,000 or did we use $2,606,000?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, it looked like you reverted to the cost approach as your preferred approach. The income approach was higher.
So we did not use the income approach whatsoever in the 2020 evaluation. Is that correct?
Sorry, you paused there.
No, I paused there because you never answered the question. Because you stated that we used the income approach to value in 2020.
Yeah.
Yet that there's a $500,000 difference. So I want to clarify.
Yes, and as I say, we never appealed this property, Mr. Furlick, in 2020. So I can't answer why the city would prefer one approach to the other, or if we agree with either approach valuation. But I wanted to state how the city had done it last time with both approaches and the capitalization we used. As I say, I don't agree with the market rents applied last cycle.
Well, okay, but with that being said, I just want to clarify the value that was $2,606,000, not the $3,193,000 that you're sharing with the board.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Okay. So you have stated your preferred approach is to use the income approach for valuation here. How do you develop a cap rate on a substation which never sells?
Well, the analysis here is to hypothetically assume that it would sell, because we're trying to determine how the market would value the site, not the value to Manitoba Hydro themselves. And in my mind, it could sell. Properties like this can sell if the site is decommissioned. And if it's sold, the market would value it based on their utility rather than what Manitoba Hydro had used it for.
And so is it 340 Rutland that sold?
Correct.
And what did that sell for?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I need to mention that, Mr. Chairman. It's not in evidence. I could find that
Well,
price.
I'm just curious about it because you referenced it in your evidence, but you have no backup information regarding it. So that's why I'm asking.
It was
Well,
$62 a square foot.
So with regards to your market rents that you've used here, just bear with me here for 1 sec. So on page 19, do you have any basement rents on your document here on page 19?
No, I do not. Typically, we don't find rents for industrial space like this. And so we had to do, again, a hypothetical adjustment. In my opinion, there should be no value attributed to the basement. But in cases like that, where we don't have evidence, we apply a nominal value.
So do you know if 95 Peguis is the same, the new construction as the building on 375 Dawson Road?
From my understanding, 95 Peguis is very similar to the last building added to the subject property, the 2020 building.
So why are my pictures of the basement finish so much different than your pictures of the same property? Because the utility, from my perspective on Peguis, and you're stating that they're the same building, is significantly higher than the rent that you're using here today. I'm mindful of the fact that there is the wires and whatnot, but if
Mr. Froelich, you're comparing pictures of a different property to the
which is exactly the same as the new addition that was built at 375 Dawson Road.
But you said you haven't inspected the property.
I've inspected 95 Peguis. I did not see 375 Dawson, but I've been told that the buildings are exactly the same.
So you inspected.
I can't say exactly, Mr. Froelich, but sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. So you inspected 95 Peguis.
Yeah.
And you've seen the photos provided by the applicant for the subject property.
Yeah.
And you're saying they're different?
I'm saying that they're very subjective in manner in terms of what I saw, in terms of the utility of the basement space and the rent that the applicant's using with regards to the utility of the basement space.
I see. So what is your question to the applicant?
So my question is that why are the pictures so different if the buildings are exactly the same in terms of utility of that space?
I can't answer that, Mr. Froelich, but
Okay.
as I say, I received the pictures from the client and then I went out to the space to inspect it myself. And that's exactly what it looks like. It's a very basic basement filled with the equipment to run the backup generators above. It's accessible only by staircase, not by elevator. In my opinion, there is no market value to this space.
Okay. I'm referring to page 18 on your land brief, your land values.
Yes.
So 6 of your comparables are higher than the 425 that you've listed here as a rent. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And 3 of them are very similar in size to the subject property, and they're all significantly higher rents. Is that correct?
There are higher land sales. And as I mentioned in my summation of the land value, those are all located in the new St. Boniface Industrial Park. So I felt an adjustment was required.
Okay. And so the property on La Jamodier, would that be, yeah, I could understand that question here as well. In terms of, I got nothing else there. You have no big, and so just to clarify for one time, you use the income approach to value as the cost approach because you just felt it was more indicative? of the market value for this property?
It's mainly because I have a number of questions or concerns about the cost approach in general for this property, or how it's been applied, but mainly the applicability of a cost approach when it doesn't recognize the market's opinion, and that is through any obsolescence factors. So, if it was, the basement was the main concern. When I first looked at this property, I thought, well, we're not applying any adjustments to this basement space that in my mind carries no value in the market. And that was a concern. But the concern actually just grew as my analysis went on.
Okay, and just so your average and medium rents are above $6.35 and $6.80, yet you're only using $4.40?
That's the blended, blended with the basement in all areas. So I tried to go through each specific area and describe why it applied various.
But it's hard to do an analysis when you haven't provided any evidence of basement rents here. So you're being very subjective in your rent on your values, are you not?
The income approach brings a certain degree of subjectivity, yes.
But wouldn't it be beneficial to have some basement rents in your evidence if you're trying to advocate for a lower overall rent?
It would be great, but unfortunately, I don't have any examples of industrial basement space that rents. Typically is just included in the rent overall. It doesn't really command any additional value, in my opinion.
No other
unless
questions?
It's accessible by elevator.
Okay, no other questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Moreski, questions for the applicant?
I just would like to know for your comparisons for the buildings and for the land on your income approach. Where did you get that information?
Where did we obtain the rental information?
Well, the sold information, I guess, on the land, and then the rental information on your lease comparables.
The land would come from, we subscribe to Sabre, so we obtain all sales that are transferred through land titles. We are aware of sales that may not go through land titles, but we are cautious about ever putting those in evidence. So all of these would have gone through land titles. I believe the instrument number is included on the chart there as well. And for the rents, we do have quite a database of rents throughout the city, both from work that we do for clients and other sources, secondary sources. At the top of, just to follow that question about our rationale, or methodology, sorry, is that when we put in rents that may be part of our internal database, we try to not include actual addresses for confidentiality purposes, but we're more than happy to share that information with the assessor should they ask.
Right. I had another question and it just flew out of my head here.
We can come back to you, Mr. Moreski, if
Okay.
Okay. Ms. Nesbitt, questions for the applicant?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
I do have a couple. You mentioned that the substation is going to be decommissioned? The old substation?
The oldest building, yes.
So
yeah.
What will happen with
Correct.
that? That won't be marketed.
I really don't know.
Okay.
Well, I'm cautious to answer that, Mr. Chairman, because I think there's all sorts of factors they'd have to consider about the safety, because it's right beside the substation itself. So I really don't know. It may just sit vacant. You know, the case of Rutland, it was a standalone property that they were able to sell off. It was remediated and then sold.
Right. Okay, thank you. And your cost on page 17, revised RCNLDs, you've accepted what the assessor has presented with the exception of the basement, is that?
Well, yeah, I mean, for the purposes of this exercise, and you'll see in my rebuttal, Mr. Chairman, I do have some concerns about the RCN overall, but for the purpose of the exercise, I tried to say, well, what if we accepted everything, but certainly not the basement, because the market would apply some factor to that. They wouldn't just value it on the cost. So it was an exercise that at the end of the at the end, I determined that it's really not an applicable valuation approach in this case, unless we answer all the questions that I have.
See. Okay, thank you. Mr. Moreski, did you have a further question?
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe discuss a little bit more with the applicant here on his valuation applied to the basement. So you're saying that a prospective client wanted to purchase these properties would not recognize the utility of the basement because there is no access in your words, because there's no elevators.
Mhm.
So you're talking about a freight elevator. Is that
That's correct.
is my assumption correct? Yeah.
Yeah, to follow that, when we do see basement space that is, used in properties like this, it needs some sort of accessibility for equipment, because this is going to be used likely for storage. I mean, it's a very bare utilitarian basement. It's only there for the wiring. So if it was on the market, I submit that the market would probably not find a lot of utility in that space without having a freight elevator to access. I can't, as I say in my answer to the question, we can't really find any examples of basement space that would be leased separately. Usually it's just part of the rent for the main floor, unless it can be properly accessed and then the utility driven.
So a prospective buyer could, in their analysis of whether or not to purchase the property, could apply a cost to put in a freight elevator, make use of that basement. 100%?
Yep, that's true. Yeah.
Okay. That's it. That's all I have. Questions?
Thank you. Now, Mr. Froelich, you have a copy of the applicant's rebuttal?
No, I do not. And so just because, we get emails sent to us, just what time did Jason send it to me this morning at?
I would have sent it shortly after 1 o'clock. Let me just bring it up here.
Okay. So yeah, I see it now, Jason.
106.
Yeah. I think it would be beneficial for all parties involved if they get the opportunity to take at least a 5-minute recess to take a look at this.
Do you have it now, Mr. Froelich?
I do have it now, yes.
Okay, so you haven't seen it until now?
No, well, rebuttal at the boardroom
Okay.
revision is usually
Okay.
just given
You-
at
you-
the time.
And you have no objection to that, Mr. Applicant, if we take a 5-minute recess for him to review it?
Not at all.
Okay, thank you. In that case, that's what we will do. We will recess. It's 2:03 now. So if we're back at 2:10, please.
Thank you.
We are live.
Thank you. I will call the meeting back to order. Mr. Slaughter, you have some rebuttal to prepare or to present, rather?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to apologize. I'm having an unstable connection, so I think there may have been a couple times when Mr. Froelich and I were talking, I may have froze. Seems to be still happening. So if you see me stuck in a certain facial expression, that's what's happening.
Okay, we'll deal with it.
Yeah, thanks. So the rebuttal evidence, Mr. Chairman, is quite short. It deals with 2 items, land and then the replacement cost new. And when I complete the rebuttal presentation after questions, I would like to make an adjustment to my income approach value as well, and I'll explain why at that time. Okay, so for the land, the city had presented 4 comparisons. I mentioned in the questioning that the last 2 are located in the new St. Boniface location, which in my opinion is superior. And the first 2 are located closer to the subject, but I do have slight concerns with both. The first on page 2, 663 Marion, was previously occupied by Maple Leaf Pork and then Keystone Processors. It had been vacant since 2012. The site was remediated. The purchaser also acquired the adjacent land to the west months later in 2015 at 645 Marion Street. And these 2 sites were in assembly to eventually accommodate the development of the new 63,500 square foot industrial flex-use warehouse. So in my mind, the fact it was assemblage and presents significant frontage along Marion, just east of Archibald, in my opinion, makes it a superior property. The second comparison, 314 Dawson, is very close to the subject. But at the time of the sale in 2011, it actually was improved. And land to building ratio at that time apparently was just under 8:1. I investigated the building descriptions recently, and we find that, yes, in fact, there was a building constructed in 1979. So obviously it was there at the time of sale. And so without trying to do the math of figuring out the residual value on the sale, I just suggest that some caution should be applied on the sale as well. So that's my only concerns, slight concerns with the land value. Now, there was a question earlier from the board about what's included and what's not for Marshall and Swift. And that's a great question. And what I've done in the rebuttal is include the descriptions of what's included for the cost. So if you recall, the assessment department had three classifications we saw: office, standard. Storage warehouse was used for many of the buildings. But if you recall, the very first building, the oldest one, was a storage warehouse, but the basement was costed separately on a separate code. And that code was called industrial engineering. So if you could please turn to page 11, I'm going to start with storage warehouse. This is the description from CoreLogic or Marshall and Swift on what is included in the base cost. 406 storage warehouse. These buildings are designed for storage and include an amount of office space commensurate with the quality of the building, typically 3 to 12%. Right off the top, as I mentioned, there's no office in these buildings. This is just basic rigid steel warehouse. Typically, they have plaster or drywall interior partitions and may include some finished ceilings, better qualities of small office fronts, and ornamental materials. The following are not included in the cost: special climate control equipment and dock levelers and material handling equipment. And you can see as you move down, depending on the class of the building, you have exterior walls, interior finish, mechanicals, and HVAC all included. So that was the reason, Mr. Chairman, for my initial question. You know, we see a base cost. Masonry bearing walls is what they had called the very first one. That was a masonry building. And then they've added exterior wall for cavity brick with block backup. I'm not saying it's wrong. I just question it because walls are included in the base cost. HVAC is also included, but I think what they mean is just the HVAC on the office. So I think that's an appropriate addition, but I question the walls. And the second thing is, I question why the basement would be costed as a different structure in that very first building. Again, the basement's costed not as a storage warehouse, but as an industrial engineering building. Now, for clarity, on page 8 is the description for an industrial engineering building. The exterior of an industrial engineering building is similar to that of occupancy 494 industrial light manufacturing. These are a completely different type of property for manufacturing, not a storage warehouse. However, the interior has a larger amount of office area and finished space than the manufacturing occupancy while containing some manufacturing and assembly areas. This isn't appropriate at all. I mean, if we were going to add a cost for the basement, it should have been in the same costing, which was a 406 storage warehouse. Now, the second concern, Mr. Chairman, and if you'd like to refer back to page 3 of the city's evidence, I welcome you, but I'll just describe it very quickly, is that when we look at the actual RCN of the upper area versus the basement, we see very little difference. The RCN for the upper area is $73.41 a foot in that very first example. And on the basement, it's $65.65 a square foot. And that difference actually is reduced in the other examples. They're almost identical RCNs. And that may be fine. It may have costed, I don't know, a similar amount to construct a basement. But again, in my opinion, the market would not value the two the same. Cost does not equal market value, in my opinion. And a lower level typically commands less utility unless you have access. And if you want to hypothesize that access, then we need to think about the cost to install that. Now, just backing up again, this is where I'm going to finalize my rebuttal and just make a mention of an adjustment I'd like to consider to my income approach. Again, we don't have examples of rents for this type of space. In my experience, when we do find basement space that has utility, either we see examples of or we apply a rate that's approximately half of the main floor. That's become kind of an established opinion that we follow and the city typically would follow. But that's when it has utility. And when it's a basic basement that has, no additional utility, is just staircase access, if we apply any value, it might be a nominal amount at 25% or $1 a square foot, for example. And that's exactly what we did here for the most part. $1 a square foot on that older building that is really an obsolete building now, $2 a square foot on the newer building. Where my error was, Mr. Chairman, is on the office building. Because as I say, I prepared my presentation before physically inspecting the site. And based on the age and my and the pictures originally, I thought that space had limited utility. It's office finished. So I'd like to change my rate on the basement of the office to be consistent with what I just mentioned, is using a rate half of that of the main floor. And that would be $3.50 a foot. If you recall, we had $7 on the main floor. So we're adjusting the basement space for the office upwards to $3.50. And the value difference, Mr. Chairman, would bring the final value to $2,297,000 rounded.
I'm sorry, that number again?
$2,297,000. And that is just under $61 a square foot. And again, we do prefer the income approach to the value. So that is the value that I'd ask the board to consider. And that completes my rebuttal and correction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Froelich, questions regarding the rebuttal?
Couple questions with regards to Mr. Slaughter. Were you and I did we do tours this summer of properties on Jesse and on Sherbrooke this year?
So,
Yes, we did.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
How is that a question regarding the rebuttal?
If you listen to my next question, you'd understand. It would be.
Okay.
Do those properties have office spaces located in those old buildings?
Yes, they did on the main floor, I believe,
Okay.
or second. Yeah.
So if I heard you correctly, are you stating that none of these substations have any office space that are a part of the configuration of the buildings?
No, I wouldn't say that, Mr. Froelich. First of all, a lot of these structures are very different as you go from substation to substation, depending on when they were built.
Yeah.
And I don't want to jump too far ahead, but when you find older, smaller substations, they may have an office component that was necessary at the time. They're not necessary anymore. Now it's just simply used for backup generators. So that's become an obsolete feature as well. They may have some people sitting in a couple of the desks, but not to the extent they were designed. But in these cases, let me be clear, at 375 Dawson, we have a separate office building, and then the additional structures are just storage warehouses with no office component.
In your rebuttal information, you had stated that that the sale was essentially, was it a tear down, or was there any use of the improvements that were as a part of the property on Dawson Road?
Well, the structure still stands, so I assume that they
Well, okay,
gained some
so
utility.
is that the brand new structure that was built, or the
No.
old structure?
No,
that
it's a
was
19.
built?
No, you'll see on that building description that we have the new structure built in 2000. Sorry, my eyes aren't that great. 13, I think it says. And then the other building that was there at the time of sale was constructed in 1979.
Okay, because you haven't provided any pictures of the building on 314 Dawson. So that's what I want to clarify.
Yes, I apologize.
Okay, because when I looked at the pictures, there was a brand new construction that took place in 2014 and everything else was torn down. So in my eyes, this property was built it was a land sale. It was not a building sale.
No, the building description with the 1979 building, that was pulled in, I believe, 2019. So it may have been demolished after that date, but certainly it was in place at the time of sale.
Okay, because let me just check one sec here, because I want to make sure that we both have the information correct.
Sure.
Okay. Well. Okay, so the information that was shared, so I'm just pulling the most recent permit here. And the most recent permit for this building's in 2014, which would indicate to me, looking at the pictures of the past and present, that this property was strictly for a land sale, not an improvement sale.
Yeah, I don't believe that was the case.
Okay, well, we could agree to disagree. Is just for the record, so just looking at the land, is the subject property superior or inferior to the parcel on 314 Dawson Road?
I'd suggest it's superior.
Okay, thank you. No other questions.
Thank you. Mr. Moritz, any questions regarding rebuttal?
Yeah, your revised number of $2,297,000. Would you be able to break that down into land and buildings?
Not via an income approach, Mr. Moretsky, because the land is part and parcel of the income generation that we're valuing.
That is by the income approach, though. You're $2,297,000.
Yeah, it's higher than our cost approach now. But again, I don't put much weight on the cost approach in this case.
Okay, can you repeat your reasoning for not being able to break down the land in the buildings?
Well, typically on the income approach, you apply what would be hypothetically an appropriate market rent for the structure, and that market rent implies the land that is necessary to operate in the structure. So access, egress, parking, etc. And therefore, the land is inherent in the value that you're applying from the income approach with the income that you're applying. If you had excess land, if there was land that could be subdivided or used separately, then certainly we would add an additional value for that land. But in this case, the buildings are situated such that the land around it is all necessary for the operations of the buildings and would be in the minds of the market as well, I submit.
Okay. Yeah, of course. Thank you. I understand that.
Okay.
That's it. No more questions.
Thank you. Ms. Nesbitt, any questions
Thank you,
regarding
Mr. Chair. I have no questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Just regarding the 314 Dawson, if that was sold for redevelopment, should demolition costs not be added to that to reflect the true value of that property?
Yeah, so reportedly, there were other structures on the site at the time of the 2011 sale. And I don't know who would have considered the remediation handled the remediation costs. But my point being that there was at least one building that's still on the record that was constructed in 1979. And so, some adjustment, I think, should be applied if we're going to put that much weight, A, on the cost approach, and B, on one sale from 2011.
Okay, thank you. And I think you also stated assembly. You don't put much weight on assembly. That's because, what's your logic behind that?
Well, the main thing about that sale, Mr. Chairman, is just the amount of frontage and the development potential, I guess. But assemblage sales typically, and I wouldn't say that we discount them or ignore them, but we have to be aware that a purchaser may pay more, or maybe the vendor may be motivated to charge more, knowing that an assemblage is underway.
Right.
So it's the IAAO standards.
If they are aware of the situation, correct? I mean, if they're not aware that there's an assembly taking place, then there's probably no reason that it wouldn't be a bona fide transaction.
I would agree.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I thank you. Is there a desire for a summation, Mr. Froelich?
Yeah, I would like one, please.
Please proceed.
For sure. As we look at this property here right now, because of the 4 different buildings of the vast different ages and the opportunity to correct it, the assessment department always wants to get it right. And if the assessment department's going to get it right, we'd like to do an inspection for this property. With that being said, this property is valued on cost. It's always been on cost. With regards to the presentation done by the applicant implying that we had done an income approach to value for this property, we always do two approaches to value. Well, not always doing, but we have access to two approaches to value. But because the nature of this property is a cost property, we had used a cost value. We did not use an income value. So to state that the value was $3 million in 2020 is factually incorrect. And my last point of train of thought is with regards to 340 Rutledge. There was a lot of talk about 340 Rutledge being a hydro property. Well, the hydro property at 340 Rutledge was an office. It's used as an office. It may have been a substation in some capacity, but it didn't have the same utility as the property that we're looking at here. And what's ironically enough with regards to 340 Rutledge, the assessed value for our property was 303. The agent believed that the value was 166 and the final value is 181. While the sale was post-reference, the sale for that property in October 2020 was $250,000. Which says to me that we weren't that far off. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Slaughter, desire for summation?
Just very quickly, I'm not putting any weight on Rutland. It's not part of the evidence. I don't know if we need to discuss it much. The only reason I mentioned is that these properties, if decommissioned, can be put on the market. But I do feel, Mr. Chairman, that the cost approach could be applicable, but we have to be cautious about how it's being costed, what is being added or not added, and the fact that a cost approach doesn't necessarily equal market. The market may not value the property based on what it costs to build. I mean, we see this all the time when somebody puts in $100,000 into a kitchen that maybe isn't to anybody else's sort of liking, and that doesn't translate to market value. The income approach is applicable in this case. The boards have accepted, in fact, preferred an income approach to these type of properties. And while subjective, I think the evidence supports the reduction that I propose. And that's all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to item 6 then. That's 1552 Taylor. Give everyone a moment to get to the proper document, and then we'll have the assessor. Everyone have the documents?
Was there a rebuttal with this one, Rod?
No.
Oh, okay.
Okay, Mr. Assessor, when you're ready.
File number is 22577. Roll number is 12097559100. Properties at 1552 Taylor Avenue. The assessed value in 2023 is $852,000. Property consists of two buildings, one built in 1957, one built in 1994. Building heights are 14 feet for the old building and 21 feet for the new building. The land area is 25,880. And the leasable. Just for whatever reason, the leasable area says 0 there. So I'm not too sure what happened, but we could probably find out later. This is a cost property that has never been appealed before, and an inspection is required on this property similar to the other one. There was a sale transfer in 2005. I guess that's when Winnipeg Hydro switched over to Manitoba Hydro. And here are the properties in question. So we have the first section as a hydro substation, 50 years old, effective year built is in 1971. This one has 14 feet wall ceiling heights. And here's the basement portion of it. So relatively speaking, we have 25,802, 44,457. On the next page, on page 4, this was the building built in 1994. With effective year of 1994. We have 3456 on the main floor and 3456 on the second floor. The cost for these are 176,227. and 314,694. Land value that we have for this property is 25,880 at 1905. It's on Taylor. It's a highly developable property. There's the nature of Taylor has changed within the past 25 years, which is why the land rate is a lot higher than the one that we were previously looking at. And looking at the building costs and the land costs, we come up with a value of $852,000. For comparables, we've got properties on McMillan, St. Mary's, Molson, and Hill Grove. And their ranges here are from $41 to $11. The $11 one is in the resident, they're all residential, but because it's on Taylor, it makes it distinctive because of where it's located at, because there is a lot of retail on Taylor. And that concludes my, on the next page, on page 9, you can see where it is on the macro perspective of where it is, and driving down Taylor between Waverly and Route 90, people are well of all the commercial activities that have taken place there. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Slaughter, questions of the assessor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Froelich, on page 3, you have the cost summary. Page 3 and 4, actually, of the RCNLD. And again, the building has been costed as a storage warehouse 406, I see. And the replacement cost new, the rate on the base cost is $50.79 on page 3, correct?
Page 3 on, on the masonry bearing walls.
Now, what we found is typically the basement wouldn't have as high of a RCN, but we saw fairly close. Is that correct?
Well, without an inspection, I don't know, Rod.
Okay, but you would agree that, again, the basement of this has been coded as a completely different building, the aforementioned industrial engineering.
Which is why an inspection is required for this property. I don't know. I can't answer that.
Sure, but you'd agree that the RCN is actually higher in this case for the basement than it is for the main floor.
Yeah, and I'm sure at the time there maybe there have been some adjustments in terms of the quality of the finish of the basement. I can't explain why the discrepancy exists.
Okay, that's fair enough. Thank you, Mr. Froelich. And the last question, your land comparisons are throughout various areas. I think they're for residential or multi-residential purposes. Sales. Yeah. The subject property on Taylor, it is bound on the south side by railway tracks. Is that correct?
Just let me double check here. Yeah, but that hasn't impacted any of the developments that have taken place on Taylor Avenue, with regards to the Walmart and Esso station and the strip mall right beside it. So the railway tracks are there, but they build huge multifamily buildings on railway tracks, Rod, as you know.
They had, but Mr. Froelich, you're aware of the municipality guidelines ever since the Lac Mégantic incident that suggest any development should be 30 meters away from the railway tracks going forward?
That hasn't impacted. Has that impacted current construction with regards to properties like in the southwest quadrant of the city of Winnipeg?
It should, unless there's, yeah, it should. I mean, that's a guideline. Yeah, I think there's examples where permissions have been granted, but that's rare.
Well,
again, this is since 2015.
Yeah, well, it's, yeah, with regards to there's a lot of commercial development that's on, that's not residential behind Taylor.
Anything constructed after 2015 that you're aware of?
2015?
Yeah.
Oh, not that I'm aware of.
Okay, that's all the questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Moretsky, questions for the assessor?
I do not have any questions.
Thank you. Ms. Nesbitt?
Yeah, Mr. Folick, I'm just looking at your land sale comparables.
Yep.
You indicated, or I can see actually, that most of these are in residential areas. Would you consider Taylor comparable to something on McMillan Avenue? And I don't know where Hillgrove Point is, but Molson?
Yeah, well, the thing is, Taylor's a mixed use because if you just go further west of the property, it is strictly residential on Renfrew Bay, where they have a significant amount of houses there. So
Across the street,
generally
right?
speaking, the land rate that we're using for this from a commercial basis, from my experience in dealing with office properties, the $19 is very fair. I don't have that as evidence right now. But the point is, it's just, I'm confident in the land rate that we're using.
So, but you say you have no evidence other than you just know?
Well, based on my many years of dealing with office properties and developments that have taken place with office properties, yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. That's all I had.
Thank you. This property is zoned as R1M residential and M1 manufacturing. Would that allow development of commercial retail properties?
Well, there, like as Rod had previously had stated, there's always outliers that end up taking place where lots of developments can or cannot take place. And so what happens is that's at the tail end of it. So even though there are properties, you know, that's the last of the gray area on Taylor. So if you look at the tennis club on Taylor, that's zoned industrial, but that's clearly not an industrial property. So it has multiple facets.
Okay, I think you mentioned you did not have an opportunity to inspect this property.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. I thank you. Mr. Slaughter, we'll hear from you, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So again, the first 6 pages are just our preamble about the approach that we've taken. The 6th page talks about the governing legislation, the Hydro Act, the fact that if one considers this to be part and parcel with the generation of the equipment, we shouldn't be seeing any grant in lieu, and certainly not on the substation itself or the land beneath. But we are approaching this from a market value perspective. On page 8, we have an overhead photo of the property. So you can see here that the building now is situated like a upside down L, and it kind of surrounds the substation itself, the external substation. The portion along the front is the portion that was built in the 1950s. And the portion that runs along the back is the higher ceiling 1994 addition. The original building was designed, and you can see this from the photograph at the bottom with fenestration. It was to house more workers in a semi sort of office environment, which has now it's just completely used for storage of the backup generator. In that way, it's really not designed for its purpose today. And the addition, of course, was added with a higher ceiling height for additional storage of the backup generators and battery storage. The entire building has basement, again, only for the housing of the wiring and conduits, accessed only by staircase. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't get inside the basement. We went to inspect the property, the client and I, and walked around the outside, but his fob wouldn't work for the door. So I had to ask questions about how it was designed, what it's being used for, what the basement is like, and any questions he couldn't answer, he obtained from other property managers. So I now have a pretty good indication exactly what this is, and that is it's only used now for, despite what it was originally constructed for, the backup generators, and the basement is just for the wiring. So in this case, we have a big concern about the cost approach, Mr. Chairman, for all the reasons that we mentioned before. But in this case, I really have a problem, or not a problem, a concern with the city's cost approach rationale. I think, costing the basement on the wrong code creates it sends it off in the wrong direction immediately. And you can see that the RCN is actually higher for the basement because they used industrial engineering, which is a completely different type of superior building. And then secondly, in any cost approach, one of the fundamental things that has to be done is ensure that the final depreciated cost is in line with market perception or demand. And we don't think that happens, especially when it comes to lower level space. So and also I have problems with the land value for various reasons, including the proximity of the railway track behind. So we have done only an income approach to value in this case. And we've looked at the exact same evidence that we did for the property on Dawson. And that was ranging for rents between $6 to $7 approximately. We used $6 on the older portion and $7 on the newer portion. We used a nominal rate, in this case, a little higher than what I used in Dawson. I probably would have preferred if I'd stuck with $1 a square foot, but I used $2.50 a square foot. And I applied that right across the board on the basement. So a little higher than typically I'd be comfortable with. Again, this is only accessed by stairs and in my mind has limited utility in the eyes of the market. But we've applied that value to the basement. So on page 13, you'll see the summary of our market rent, potential market rent analysis. And blended, including the basement, the market rent would be $4.60 a square foot. That's $6 and $7 on the upper and $2.50 on the basement. In this region, the vacancy allowance applied by the city is a little bit lower than in Old St. Boniface. It's 3.5%. We've applied that. Shortfall rate is the same at $3.85 a square foot. And again, Mr. Chairman, so long as the correct capitalization rate and in our mind market rents are applied, we're not going to argue the non-recovered allowance. Typically, the city applies 3%. We prefer 7%, which is contemplated or discussed in our separate study that I'm not submitting today because we'll just accept 3%. And capitalization rates on page 14, same discussion, same evidence as with Dawson. And again, I conclude that this would be at the lower end of Class B. And so we apply 7.5% as the capitalization rate. So on page 15, we have the income approach summary, applying the hypothetical market rents for basement and upper level, vacancy allowances, non-recovered allowances, and capitalization rate of 7.5%. Would indicate a value, Mr. Chairman, of $551,000. And that completes our presentation. Thank you.
I thank you. Mr. Froelich, questions for the applicant?
My first question is with regards to the market rent adjustments. If I'm correct, on the Dawson property, the applicant stated that the basement rent should be 50% less than the main floor rents. So would that not change the basement rents to $3 and $3.50 effectively?
Yeah, sorry. What I mentioned on Dawson is we had different types of basement there. We had the substation basements and the office basements. And I was using approximately 25% or a nominal amount on the basements. But what I discovered after I submitted the evidence from the inspection is that the office building, just that one building, actually had office finish in the basement. And in those cases, we apply a rate of half the main floor.
Okay, but you haven't inspected the basement of this property, so how do we know that there's not office space in the basement of the subject property?
I discussed on site with the site manager who couldn't let me in the basement, unfortunately, and then he confirmed with others at Manitoba Hydro exactly what this basement was and what it was used for.
So, but without actual having evidence, it's sort of hard for us to sort of quantify the actual finish of the space. Is that not correct?
Well, it is admittedly second information, but fairly well corroborated and discussed, and I am under oath. So.
Is it true that you're seeking a value for this property that is below the 2014 assessment?
It may be. We never reviewed or appealed this property before.
Okay, so it's never been appealed. It's never been internally inspected, correct?
Well, I can't say ever. Altus only started working with Manitoba Hydro in, I believe, 2016.
No other questions.
Thank you. Mr. Moreski, questions?
I do not have any questions.
Ms. Nesbitt, any questions?
No, Mr. Chair, I do not.
Actually, I do have one other question, if possible, for It's with regards to the cap rate used by Altus on page 9 of their brief.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. At the time of the sale for 110 Sutherland, was there a rent in place for this property, or was there not a rent in place for this property for 110 Sutherland?
That is a good question, Mr. Froelich. And can you give me a moment to investigate it?
Yeah,
Because
of course,
typically we
Rob.
would have the full study, but I've just included the summaries here. So just give me a moment. And while I'm searching for this, I just will start by stating the rationale when we do our capitalization rates. Appraisal theory states that we must do it in the same manner that we value the subject property. And in that way, we do a market approach to the income, making sure that we use the same parameters. For example, if I'm seeking 7% for non-recovered, I have to make sure that we've done that in our cap rates. So that means we either have an actual rent that we then test to market, or we don't have an actual rent and we apply market. So to answer your question, just give me one moment. Just opening the actual study, and then I'll find that page which shows our rationale. Eagle. Sure, we're not going too far. 110 Sutherland has a market rent applied of $5.50 a square foot. And so what we would do, Mr. Froelich, is we have in our cap rate study the summary page that shows the market rent comparisons we use to determine the $550 a square foot to be applied. And again, it's much of the same rationale that I've applied to the subject properties. It's actually in keeping. So, we're at 6 and 7 for the subject. This is at 550.
So,
and we have the same adjustments for vacancy in a bit lower than the subject where we're using 3. But the capitalization rate at the end of that calculation is the 7.93%.
who is the vendor for the property of the sale, Rod?
I don't have that here.
Okay. Was it Greyhound buses? Was it a bus manufacturer?
I really don't know. It
Okay.
very well could be. I think
because the reason why I asked, Rod, and it's important in terms of integrity, we have this property being owner occupied in the previous years of the sale. And from our perspective in 2020, we were criticized because in our cap rate study, we had used some properties in terms of using an owner occupied. We had a property that was partially vacated. There was a rent in place, but it was vacated for 6 months prior to the sale. And we got criticized for that. So, based on the information that we had here, this property is owner occupied and we wouldn't do a cap rate study on it. So
Yeah,
I just want to make you aware of that.
I don't know why you'd be criticized for that, because I think it's in keeping with appraisal standards that you can. It's not ideal because it's not a real rent, but even a real rent, you need to make sure is at market.
Okay.
So what we've done, we call it an imputed capitalization rate. It's the
So-
same exercise we do with the subject property. I think it's completely fair, Mr. Froelich.
Okay, so then my next question is that on your cap rate study, then for this property, why did you guys use a rent of $4.81 in the 2020 appeal when it's $5.50, when the supposed rent was $5.50 based on your information?
Well, I mean, I don't want to answer for whatever the agent's conclusion was. I'll say that Altus is very careful across the board in analyzing market rents at the time of the reference date to determine. So I think whatever was done to determine that market rent was supported. The only things I can mention off the top of my head are that this is 2 years after the reference date from last cycle. So we're doing the same analysis. We just end up at 550.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted verification on your basements. You've used $2.50, and I think you mentioned you would like to have used $1 or like you did similarly, but in using those rents, you've also applied the same vacancy, collection loss, shortfall, and non-recoverables to the basement area by adding them all together.
Yeah, actually, great question, Mr. Chairman. you know, in hindsight, actually, it's not really appropriate to apply the shortfall to that space because it's such a minor part of the value of the property. But I will submit it's not going to drastically change the value because the vacancy allowance is only 3.5%. But bang on, that's a great point.
Thank you. Desire for a summation on this one, Mr. Froelich, or?
I just want to reiterate that this is a Manitoba Crown Corporation. We are a municipal government. So one way or another, the taxpayer is going to be impacted by whatever decision that takes place here. And for us to be truly fair and equitable to the taxpayers of the city of Winnipeg, and an inspection for this property would be nice. And it's going to be done in the future.
Thank you. Mr. Slaughter, desire for a summation?
I don't think so, Mr. Chairman. You know, just a reminder that we're to look at market value, and I think our analysis, though subjective, accomplishes that. And I'm sure Manitoba Hydro would welcome the inspection from the city.
I thank you. Okay, that will bring us to item number 7 on our docket. Just one moment while I get to that. Well, sorry, you have to bear with me. I've it's gone out of SharePoint. There we go. That's 437 Stafford. When you're ready, Mr. Assessor, we'll hear from you, please.
File number is 22-576. Roll number is 12-097-60560. 5600. Value is $2,248,000. It's a hydro substation based on the cost approach to value. Property was built in 2012. The wall height is 12 feet. We've never inspected this property, and it's our understanding that the agent will be asking for a 54-1 on this property. I could go through other the details, but I don't know if that's necessary, Mr. Chairperson.
No, I don't believe you need to go through them in detail. Just tell us what approach you used and the final value that.
Yeah, the cost approach is used for this property. We have the cost of the buildings as $577,000. We have the cost of the land of $1,671,000, and we have a total cost of $2,248,000.
Thank you. Mr. Slaughter, any questions of the assessor?
No questions. Mr. Froelich's correct. We'd like to seek a confirmation of the assessment, please.
Thank you. And Mr. Moreski, any questions for the assessor?
I do not.
Thank you. Ms. Nesbitt, any questions?
No questions.
Thank you. And I have none. Mr. Slaughter, you're just requesting for the value to be confirmed. You're not presenting any further evidence at this time, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, I thank you. Okay, is there a desire for summation? Mr. Assessor, I'm assuming not.
No, that is correct.
Mr. Slaughter, I'm assuming not. Thank you. In that case, we've heard all the items that are scheduled, and this hearing will now be adjourned. Thank you very much for your presentations, gentlemen.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone. I hope everyone
Thank
has
you.
a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, take care.